Hello, and welcome to the Silly-meme-rillion, a rereading, where we go through the Silmarillion chapter by chapter as we reread it and present our hot takes on the latest and greatest of the first and second ages of Middle-earth. We're your hosts, Vee.
And I'm Fern, and we're here to take you on a wild ride that would probably make Tolkien roll over in his grave. Listener discretion advised.
No, really, expect Melkor the Cowardly Giant, Elvish existentialism, and Dwarves.
Still keen? Then grab your beverage of choice, kick back, and enjoy the chaos. So, welcome everybody to the second episode of the Silly-meme-rillion. Today we're going to be talking about the first two chapters of the Quenta Silmarillion itself, those being of the beginning of days and of Aule and Yavanna. So, V, shall we begin with a quick summary?
Yes, please, because I'm not even completely sure what just happened, if I'm going to be honest. It took me a little bit to get into these first couple of chapters. Well, the first chapter itself, it starts to pick up towards the end and then into the second chapter, but right now I have no clue what's going on.
So, to summarize, basically how it begins is that all of the Ainur are in Middle-earth, and they're kind of there. Melkor is there too, and he still wants to fuck shit up, but Dulkas is really big and scary and has huge arms, so he scares Melkor away, because Melkor doesn't want to deal with that berserker energy. Then the Ainur are living, or rather the Valar are living on this big landmass called Almaren, which we can pretend is like Pangaea. And clearly they have some kind of moth problem. So they build lamps, presumably in order to attract the moths and thereby kill them. They're making moth lamps on Pangaea. But Melkor said moth rights and destroyed the lamps while everybody was having a party, full on like bacchanal. He just went in and he's like, y'all are drinking and like screwing each other and nobody gives a shit about the moths. So he destroys the lamps and then yeets off to his rebel base in the north. And then Yavanna deals with this by basically just inventing time because she can. And then the Valar are a bit less sad, but clearly not Manwë and Varda, because they go and live on the top of a tall mountain looking out over Middle-earth, probably trying to, find more moths that they can destroy. But they don't want to help the rest of Middle-earth, so they chose isolationism because they could not have moths. And that is the story of the beginning of days.
And what a ridiculous one that is. I swear I have no clue what happened in this entire chapter. It was so disjointed. There were so many different stories going on. And I think that goes back to, what Christopher Tolkien said about the Silmarillion is just a bunch of scraps and snippets of shit his father wrote. And you can clearly see this in the beginning of days because it literally starts, Tuatkas just shows up and scares the shit out of Melkor because he's like laughing and fighting and he's probably really naked and he's just going at him and Melkor's like, I can't deal with this right now, and so he runs and hides away like a coward he is. And then you go into, Arda is created and the Valar are happy and whatever, and they create these lamps because Yavanna wanted them. Like, it's a team effort, and there's like this never ending daylight, which I think is pretty impractical, to be honest.
Exactly.
Like,
I mean, like, clearly the fact that they are like non-corporeal really shows, because I don't think they actually knew how to make a habitable world for the children of Ilúvatar. Like, I guess it didn't matter because the elves weren't there yet, but like endless light, that sounds so exhausting. Like, I guess the world was just on such a different scale back then, right? They talk as well about the trees that are like crowned with clouds but with twilight at the bottom, and it's like, okay, that's cool, but that's a world for gods. That's not a world made for the children of Ilúvatar.
to be honest, I kind of feel bad mostly for like the dwarves and men who come later after the Eldar, because they're the ones who would have suffered under this endless light the most, because they're the ones who need to sleep, they're the ones who need to, eat and die and all this other stuff that happens to them that doesn't happen to the elves. And
I think elves need to eat occasionally, but yes, they do not need to die. That is a key point.
are you kidding me? Elves don't eat. They don't eat anything.
They thrive. They thrive off music and starlight and sweet sound of bird song. So basically, we have the lamps, we have Almarin, and we have a very cool line about what is going on in Almarin because Melkor may have fucked off away to Utumno, which is his great big fortress in the north, but there's reference made to spies among the Maiar, and I think there's no doubt between the two of us as to who the chief among these spies may be. No.
Yeah, it's definitely Myron Sauron. Like,
Mhm.
he's the only one, at least, that's mentioned that is part of like this court and like, well, not yet created Valinor. He's part of the Valar, though, and I personally believe that he is influencing the other Maiar within like this court of godly beings, and Melkor is getting the people who are outside of it, who might still be in the void with Eru, or who might just be, doing whatever it is they do that's not in Arda.
Teamwork.
But Sauron, yeah,
We
teamwork.
love.
Sauron is the one who's pulling the strings within the actual society of the Valar, and it's right under everyone's noses.
Yeah, it seems to be something he's pretty good at is like being sneaky with how he recruits people to the dark side.
I feel like it's really difficult to even talk about this chapter because there is no like continuity between it. It goes from one thing to the other to the other to the other, because you start like with Tulkas and his berserkering, and then you go into like this great party and the lamps, and then the lamps being destroyed, and then Valinor being created, and it's a lot. But it also, it doesn't follow anything. There's no like exactly a timeline. It's even kind of difficult to imagine like how these events are taking place geographically, unless you already know, you've read like the Atlas of Middle Earth, or you've seen like other pictures or designs that show like how this is happening in like the context of Arda. So it's a really like not fun
No, it
chapter.
isn't.
Also, if you hear my dogs barking, I'm sorry. We're in quarantine. I can't go anyplace without them. So,
Life's tough, It's like we don't get kid invaders, we get dog invaders. Okay, so yeah, like I totally understand what you mean about the disjointedness of the chapter is just reflected in in how we can tackle it when we talk about it. So hopefully it's not too confusing for our listeners to keep track of all these really interesting aspects of the chapter.
yeah, and then Yavanna, she like plants her seeds after like the lights have been lit and everything, and like everything starts to grow. Arda is finally completed. Everyone's super happy, and they all sort of go to rest on this island that's kind of in the middle of everything, and as Fern said, on like this Pangea-esque Arda. And that's when Turkas decides he wants to get married. And they have a wedding. He espouses Nessa, who's the sister of Orome, and they have a good old merry time. They're celebrating that Arda is done. It's called the Spring of Arda. Like the lights are lit. Tulkas can rest because he just had the wedding night of his life. And all while this is happening,
Mhm.
Melkor is planning his attack, like at that moment, kind of red wedding esque at
Very,
that
very red
moment.
wedding-esque. I feel like something like this must have happened in Norse mythology as well. Like it's really it's been gnawing at me, but I cannot for the life of me figure out which myth it is. I feel like this is a really like prevalent motif that you get in a lot of like these epic stories about, bad things happening during a time of celebration because it's such a violation of the whole concept of the safety and the joviality of having a party, of having a wedding, of having a feast, and then the bad things happen. Ugh. It's like this horrible, horrible, like cosmic karmic debt that gets paid.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to Melkor's character in general. Like, the symbolism of him attacking during this jovial time, like this peak jovial time where everyone thinks that he's no longer really a worry. They think that he's crawled away and he's hidden, he's gone dying in a hole. Like they're ready to move on with Arda, they're ready to accept the children. Um, but Melkor is not. And he shows that very clearly in his actions where he destroys these lamps that create this unending light and brightness. He's like, fuck you, fuck your light, consume the world in darkness. And then he fucking runs away. Like he destroys the lamps. He does this power play on them, like in the middle of the happiness, in the middle of his wedding. Like he's been like scheming, and he comes in and he destroys like this epic power or whatever, and then he runs away. Like it's so cowardly because sees Tulkas get up, and he's like, once again, I can't deal with this, so I'm gonna bounce. And it really reminds me of like, especially like all of those like military type, I guess, missions where people like come in, fuck shit, a bunch of shit up real quick, and then bounce really quickly because they know that they're not going to be able to survive the aftermath. And that's kind of what Melkor does, but I think it's less military might and more cowardlyism,
Cowardice.
however you would say it. Cowardice. That's a word. That's a word. But yeah, I think I think it's more that than anything else.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. I agree. And I think it also speaks a lot to the nature of evil and how it's perceived, like in our world too, but like in Middle Earth in general. Like, this idea of Melkor acting as this force that has been marring creation right from the beginning. I don't know if it's a phrase that's used in the Silmarillion actually, but there is this concept of Arda Marred, basically, that because of everything that Melkor put into it, there will always be this inherent like discord in Arda. And I think that really is present in the way evil operates, right? Like, as you said, it comes in at the happiest of moments and then it bounces in an act of cowardice and goes away, but it never quite goes away, right? It's always there in the background, corrupting things or waiting for the right moment to strike. And that seems to be a really prevalent theme in all of the legendarium, that evil can be defeated, but it can come back just as easily. And like, Melkor embodies that, and as long as he's in the world of Arda for the Silmarillion, he really like espouses that. And I do think that Sauron carries that mantle on into the later ages as well. And you find it in Lord of the Rings too. You have those idyllic places that seem like they will never be touched by darkness, like the Shire, and then they do get touched by darkness, but then it falls to the people to like drive that out, and the world will never be the same again, but the evil can be driven out. Is this Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of first instance of that happening in Middle Earth in this chapter.
It's also really interesting, like going into that, is when Melkor does this thing, when Melkor destroys the lamp, he also reshapes the world once again. He utterly destroys the island of Elmarin, and he kind of splits like this Pangea into more what we see of Valinor all the way to the west, and Middle Earth and Beleriand, and it causes Manwe almost to decide that he's tired. Like, at least that's how I read it, is that he's tired. He doesn't want to deal with this anymore. He creates these giant mountains to kind of separate the Valar from the rest of Arda that they had just created, and I guess is just, it's gone right now. And he creates this giant mountain that he and Varda sit on, and they just look out on the world. They can see everything that's happening. They get messages of what's happening, but they're no longer participating in it. And I think that speaks volume to their drive, like what Melkor did to their drive. Because, like, honestly, if I had spent all this time creating something and then someone just came in and so catastrophically fucked it up, I'd be really upset too. I'd be like, I don't know that I want to keep doing this anymore, type of thing. So he, like, Manwe really like assumes his mantle of king on the mountain, like instead of under the mountain, king on the mountain, and he just kind of stays there for now. And it's really, Yavanna and Aule who go back into the world to create things. And of course, Melkor is there too. Melkor is hiding in his little hideout, and he is still scheming. He is ready to fight again. And even Yavanna keeps telling the Valar, there's like, yeah, we are eventually going to need to fight Melkor because this will keep on happening. But as of right now, no one's listening to her.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, speaking of Yavanna, I think it's really interesting that she then takes the next proactive, step of rekindling that spark of like hope or light in Aman, in this land in the west, by creating the two trees of Valinor, which are these two beautifully described trees. And those trees essentially create a timekeeping system of a 12-hour day, which I think is really fascinating. It's very cool that they can already begin a sort of count of time that did not exist at the time that the lamps were created. Do you have any further thoughts on the trees other than that they're pretty, V?
No, not really. This was very it took me kind of out of the story is one of the things that was like, what the fuck is going on? You just had Valinor essentially created, and then it goes on to like these random trees, and like I'm just already thinking of like, what are you guys gonna do about Arda? But they're like, we created time, I guess. And it was just like another one of those things that just kind of threw me off as far as like the continuity. It was a beautiful passage. It's really interesting.
It's visually
It
evocative. Yeah.
yeah, I like that word, evocative. What
Thanks.
is that? Um yeah, it is visually evocative. Um you have this really nice passage, and it shows Yavanna's power, which I think is really cool. I really like her. I think she's badass. Um, but besides that, it doesn't really do much for me. I guess maybe because I'm not as interested in like this whole world building creation myth type thing, and I'm sure there are plenty of other readers who feel the same as me. Like we're worried about the characters, we're worried about the actual story, and less about like these creation myths and like, and this is how time was created, and light was created, and day and night was created, and the world became round when it was flat. That was created too. Like, just tell me what happens to Melkor and Manwë and Aule and like all these other characters that exist in this world.
Exactly, yeah. Like, I understand his desire to kind of give rationale to everything that exists in Middle Earth and why it exists as it does. But I think that's why, like, chapter two, which we're going to discuss, um, is such a more engaging chapter, I think, because we actually get to start seeing how the Valar, like, debate and talk about what they're doing with the world and like how they want to interact with it. And because, as V said, Yavanna and Aule are the ones who are really active in this time when, Manwë and Varda have become like understandably like detached after everything that Melkor did to their creation. Um, they Yavanna and Ali start to take some really proactive steps about what they want to do in the world, proactive enough that Eru actually gets involved. So I think this would be a great time to summarize what happens in chapter two of Ali and Yavanna.
Dwarves
That's it. That's what happens. Dwarves and Ents. Dwarves and
and
Ents.
ants and marital strife is what happens.
And like,
Basically,
look, modern day like couples counseling cannot hold a candle to just creating dwarves and Ents. Like, come on.
but basically, you have Aule, and Aule is this smith and creator, and he likes to build things, and he gets super impatient. He's tired of waiting for the children of Iluvatar. He's tired of whatever. So he goes and he creates his own little creatures, and these creatures are very lovely dwarves. And he very happily creates them, and like he not just creates them, they have a will of their own. Like they are really creatures in themselves. They're not just creatures that bend to his will and creatures that exist just for him. Like they are their own little beings, which is really beautiful that he's able to create these these things. And Eru comes down. He's like, bro, what the fuck? I had a plan, and the plan was this. And like Eru already knew that this was happening. Eru saw Aule creating his little creatures. He let it happen, and then of course Eru only intervenes after these beings already are sentient and have life. And of course, when Aule realizes, his dad and his master have seen him do this great, like, I guess, sin, essentially. Like, he's created life outside of the life that Eru like proclaimed was going to happen. He created life before these children that his creator had prophesied. And of course Eru comes down, he's like, bruh, my guy. And you practically have Aule on his knees begging and saying, I needed something, and they're yours if you want them, but I will also destroy them if you need me to. And of course Aule is devastated at the prospect of destroying these little creatures, because these creatures are now sentient, and they're like, oh no, please don't hurt me, underneath Aule's giant hammer that he's holding over them, as Eru is standing over him and demanding that he explain himself. And Eru actually is like, nah fam, it's chill. I just wanted to scare you a bit. I already know how this plays out, so obviously I already know that these creatures are part of our timeline. But yeah, your creatures are not going to be part of this timeline until much later, after my children show up. The thing that I planned from the beginning. It doesn't matter what you think or what you thought or what you tried to do. It's going to happen afterwards. But you can keep them.
Yeah, and then with the dwarves now in Middle Earth, it becomes clear that they are going to eventually have to use the world, the natural things like trees and such. And Yavanna gets big mad about that, especially because it was her husband who made them and didn't tell anybody about it. So she wants to create something to protect her planet that basically she has been covering with flora and fauna. She goes to talk to Manwe. Then Manwe basically kind of has this like trans vision thing with Eru, and Eru basically goes, "Yeah, like it's cool. I give my okay stamp for this endeavor." And then Manwe and Yavanna like sit on a hill and talk a little bit, and then she gets the go ahead to make ends, so she does that. And then she goes up to her husband at the end, and she was like, "Yeah, haha, you know, uh, your people can try and like cut down my trees, but my trees are gonna just like kill them because they're badass." And Aule literally just says, "But they will still have need for wood," and goes back to his smithing, and that's the end of the chapter.
I honestly kind of love this chapter for a lot of different reasons. I think it gives characterization to some of the greater gods that we see, and also just the fact that Yavanna, like, it really did not click in her head. Like, she did not think about it. She's like, I create all the plants, the flora, and the fauna. Like, she didn't think that the children would actually use it for anything. Like, she thought like those were her creations, and they would stay her creations, and they would be unmarred and untouched and beautiful and perfect. And she didn't realize, like, no, these babies are gonna need things to play with, and they're gonna need things to stay alive with, and those things are her things that were created. And she's really, really upset by this. She's like, what? And she goes running to Manwe, and she's like, but tell me this isn't true. And Manwe's like, did you really not think of this? She's like, I really didn't think of this.
And like that's the sad part, because like in any other situation you could just, like, as we love to do, just blame Eru for not telling his kids what the children of Iluvatar would require. But clearly somebody knows, because Manwë says like, you really didn't know, you really didn't get it. So clearly I think Yavanna was just really excited about creating. And I think this aspect of like creation and the creative spark, and not quite thinking about like the implications of it, is also it's a big theme in this chapter, because that's the case for Aule as well, right? And this whole like Abraham Isaac kind of thing that he gets going on by creating the dwarves. Because for many different reasons, one of them being that it proves what a great foil he is to Melkor, and to a lesser extent Sauron, in his approach to like creativity. because he creates these dwarves because he wants to like teach them a language, but he also, when he creates them, he does it as an estimation of what the children of Iluvatar are, because he doesn't know what they're going to look like, because that vision was not shown to them. um I think it's very fascinating when you contrast it with what Melkor does, like with the corruption, the creation of the orcs, and what Sauron will later do with the creation of like black speech, and also with the way, therefore, that Eru reacts to this. Not just, okay, the way that Aule as the creator reacts to it with his like contrition, and the way Eru reacts to it as the creator god is so different compared to like Melkor, who is very much seen as like the mirror, like the dark mirror of Aule.
Yeah, for sure. And not even that, like, this is Aule's first, I guess, transgression against Eru. We see um where we see Melkor's first transgression early on in the Ainulindale, where he starts singing his own song, and Eru kind of crucifies him in front of everyone. Of course, Melkor doesn't fall on his knees and beg for forgiveness immediately when he's caught out. He pushes back against Eru multiple times before Eru kind of destroys him um, in their little singing contest thing that they got going on. And Aule is truly terrified, it seems like, once Eru finds out. He's terrified for his creation, and he's terrified for himself because he knows that he did wrong, and he doesn't want to end up, I guess, like Melkor, because there's already this first wrong that you have, and there's already this fear that's built, like, what will Eru do to me if I do him wrong? And I think Eru knows that as well, and Eru uses it to his advantage. And again, he kind of uses like this badness to frame himself as good, because he does say, look what you did, but also I'm okay with it. And we have to remember that Eru knows everything that's going to happen. So Eru already has seen this. In fact, he sees the guy working on his shit and doesn't stop him. He waits until the very end to then show up and be like, what do you have to say for yourself? And I think that's again characterization for Eru and who he is as a creator god.
Yeah, 100%. I think we get a lot of really telling. I mean, we already have a lot of telling characterization about Eru, but there's also this bit with the creation of the dwarves where he refers to how he like basically deliberately encourages strife between the children of my adoption, quote unquote, which refers to the dwarves, and the children of my choice, quote unquote, referring to like the men and the elves. And like, I'm sorry, that's especially with the phrasing of children of my choice and children of adoption, that is just so gross. It smacks of that kind of horrific like sibling favoritism that exists in like way too many families, and the differentiation between like the primacy of blood versus other genuinely like good people and good creations and good children. And like, I don't know, it speaks to a lot of the other sibling drama that seems to be a huge like linchpin in a lot of the legendarium. Like, we already have it between Melkor and his siblings, especially like with Manwë as king of the world. You have it in other instances too, which we'll get to when we get to the elves. Like, for example, between Feanor and his brothers, there's also going to be like sibling drama that severely impacts like what happens in Middle Earth. And it's just Eru is literally just a horrible fucking parent. Like, he's just encouraging like strife and enmity between his children, whether it's his Ainur or whether it is his elves and men or whether it is like, the dwarves. Like, I don't see benevolence in this. I just see, the vindictiveness and favoritism, honestly.
No, I completely agree with you. And then, like, as the chapter moves on, we kind of talked about Yavanna and like not understanding how her creations would be affected by these other creations. And I think kind of like that speaks to another theme that like nobody kind of realizes how, even though they're working together to create this place, this world, uh they don't really realize what that means. Like they're still all working on little pieces of their own project. Like they don't realize that it's supposed to work together at some point for the children to live in it and to survive and such. It feels like they're all kind of obsessed with their own things, and so they create their own things individually, and they don't recognize that, hey, no, that is going to affect this, which is going to affect that, which is going to affect this. And I think again, like that goes back to kind of them being children in themselves. Like they are Eru's children, they may be gods, but they are still very much, it seems like, teenagers who are trying to work on this and figure things out as they go along. And that's pretty clear with Yavanna. But then you have like this issue where Aule straight up does not tell her that he's creating the dwarves. It's only after Eru comes and does this whole thing that Aule goes and he confesses and he's like, hey, I created these things, but it's okay because Eru said okay. And she realizes, this is going to affect her. And she kind of does something petty. She has the Ents created in to spite her husband. And she thinks that this is like a win in itself. And I think that speaks to, again, how childish a lot of these characters are. You have Melkor who, destroys things and then runs away because he's gonna get beat up. You have the kid who beats everyone up. You have, the two kids that decide to distance themselves from the teen
They
drama.
chill in the library over lunchtime.
Yeah, exactly. They don't want anything to do with it. You have like that one kid that's kind of like in the seas, I guess. Just he's just there in the corner. Like nobody really knows what's going on with him, but he's doing something. And you have, the cute couple who are like warring with each other because you lied to me and this is how I'm going to get you back for it type thing.
They don't have basic communication skills and they get really vindictive about it.
And I really like this characterization. It really shows like almost the humanity in these gods. It really, you can see like the influence of like us, the Eldar, in telling these stories, because I'm sure this is not the way that Eru or Manwe or Aule or Varda or Yavanna want to be represented.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with everything that you just said. Well, speaking of children, actually, there's a really interesting line that I wanted to highlight regarding not the childishness or the nature of the Ainur as Eru's, the offspring of Eru's thought, but about the children of Iluvatar, that is the men and elves, and the nature of their existence in Middle Earth. Because there's this line where Eru says that, he gave to men strange gifts, which made me laugh at first because I was like, yeah, you mean like dying? But like that is like the gift. That's one of the great gifts that he gave them. Was the gift of death, and about also this, like, basically how they should find no rest in the world as it is in Arda. And I think that this, like, personally, that is quite actually a relatable sort of uh mentality or a relatable sensation, because I think, we endeavor to seek and find something, some greater thing that we don't know what it is, and we try and do that with myth and with story and with song, which I think that's kind of what Tolkien is driving at with his own, sub-created world of Middle Earth and Arda. But there is this, like, inner drive in people, and we give it different names and it presents in different ways, but it's this endless, like, yearning for something that's bigger than us. And then you couple that with mortality and it becomes super interesting, especially because mortality of humans, it's clear from this whole, like, passage when Eru is describing the nature of, like, men, that mortality is tied up with free will, basically, because he says that men can shape their life beyond the music of the Ainur, which implies that, regardless of the will of Iluvatar in creation, there isn't necessarily predestination in Arda, at least for men, because there like, they are not bound up to the fate of the world, to the circles of the world, unlike the elves who are. and who, none of the Valar nor the elves know what's going to happen to them at the end of days, like, which is honestly kind of existentially terrifying, because with men, the end is just death, and then what happens beyond that nobody knows. But for the elves, you know it's not the end of life, it's the end of existence, which is pretty terrifying. But I just think this notion of predestination not necessarily applying to men within Arda itself is a really fascinating concept that Tolkien introduces and differentiates men from elves in this really like fundamental metaphysical way. But of course, then, like, it has to then say that men resemble Melkor most of all, which is just fucking elf propaganda. Honestly, like, knowing that elves wrote the Silmarillion, like, that is just elf propaganda. I'm sorry, men resemble Melkor most of all. Haha, fuck you.
And how Manwë was like upset about this as well. Like he also saw that men were like Melkor, and I think that really, really does a disservice to men in general. Especially because like in the Lord of the Rings, we get to see like the different aspects of men, and there is a lot of courage and hope. You see Nienna, you see Yavanna, you see Manwë and Aule, and like everything that they do, like they are, yeah, they're people. They're not just one dimensional creatures that were created as like a sort of fall guy for a god. I mean, we talked about this in the last episode. They have a lot more going for them, and just say that they're these jealous things that cannot create, they can only destroy, is a really, really like it's poor. It's very poor. It's not nice at
Yeah, it's a
all.
really unfair comparison completely. And it smacks of like elvish exceptionalism, which is also ridiculous in and of itself, because the events of the Silmarillion will prove that elves can be really horrible to each other as well. They can espouse exactly the same principles that they supposedly claim, like, men resemble most of all. Like, sorry, elves can be assholes to each other as well, as bad as men can be assholes to each other. So it's not a line that I vibe with, to be honest. I think it's the elvish bias.
Yeah, yeah. It's not really fun when you think about it. And also, I think it might speak of jealousy, because even though there's like fear of death in men, and like as we get into Numenor and stuff like that, we're gonna discuss that in detail. But then elves, I mean, they can die, like they can die, and they go to the Hall of Mandos and whatever. But then, uh, will they be restarted again with the second song? Will they be part of this? Like Edu already says, the men are going to be part of that, and like no matter where they disappear to after death, they're coming back for the second song. We don't know shit about Valar. We don't know shit about the Eldar. So there's this kind of like longing for their gift as well. Also, the fact that like they're not tied to fate. They can do whatever the fuck they want to. They can make their own choices, and they can make their own mistakes, and they can die in a fucking hole. There's a lot of different things that men can do that elves just aren't able to, because of the confines of their creation. And I think it's really interesting to look at as well. Like there is this jealousy, you know, between all of these different species and races.
Yeah. I think just the very nature of, I guess this really comes back to the beginning, doesn't it? The very nature of like Middle Earth, and like its creator in and of itself has engendered these conflicts. Like, it's like the conflict is built into the very fabric of Middle Earth. Like, there's no way around it, really, with the natures of the different beings and the way that they understand the world and the perspectives they're given about it, however limited or however broad, temporally, spatially. It's just, I guess that's the biggest takeaway and the biggest strength of these chapters, is it shows us where a lot of these deep conflicts that drive all of the events that later happen in Middle Earth kind of come from.
And I think that is a great place for us to leave off for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we're going to do Of the Coming of the Elves and the Captivity of Melkor. It's a big chapter within itself, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to be happening in it. So we wanted just to make one chapter for the entire episode. Again, thank you for joining us, and please leave your comments, like us on Spotify, follow us. We look forward to hearing what you think.
Once again, many thanks and Namarie.